Thanks, folks. Hello, I'm Sin. I'm going to be talking to you about a bunch of things that I did wrong as a young CTI analyst and a bunch of things that I probably still do wrong as a not so young CTI analyst. Before we do get started, I'm going to be super rude and give a warning. If I randomly mute myself and look like I don't know how to dab, it's not because I'm trying to seem like I'm really cool on a stream that I know is being recorded. It's that my lungs are currently trying to become external organs. So I have random coughing fits, which are not super exciting or very romantic to listen to. Hopefully, and given how bad I am at technology, I make no promises, but hopefully I'll remember to unmute myself as well. If not, it's going to be a really exciting talk, I promise. So Civilized talk just before this was actually really, really awesome. It's a great way, and it's a great lead into some of the things that I'd like to talk about as well, obviously from a slightly different angle. Mainly in that it's not straightforward what CTI does. I'll lean on Kaz's talk earlier as well, where as mentioned, application security means many different things to many different people. CTI is much the same. And that's kind of a big deal when everyone is starting to throw around this term, at least in the Australian infosec market, a lot more now. It's been around in the US for a while and is probably a little bit more mature there. But I've had quite a few discussions with quite a few very senior infosec people who've got really different ideas as to what cyber threat intelligence actually consists of. And I've only got about half an hour today, so I'm not even going to try and define it because that's just going to waste everyone's time and start way more arguments on the internet than Twitter can currently handle. What I do want to say, though, is that people's experience with it is going to be quite different. Some folks are going to be really technically focused. Some folks are going to be almost completely non-technically focused. So if you're talking about CTI roles with people, if you're looking at the blue and red like approaches to your career, you really want to dig down into what's actually expected in a role. And conversely, if you're on the hiring side, probably make your expectations quite clear with candidates. Otherwise, you're going to get super exciting things pop up into your wonderful inbox well before they are actually comfortable in dealing with anything that you actually want them to do. So, what I'd like to talk about today is a bunch of things that I did wrong, either myself or the team that I was working did wrong, but I'm happy to wear the hurt for that. Not because I'm really excited about failing at things. I generally don't like it. I'm a human being. But at the same stage, I learned a bunch of lessons out of it. I'd like to think that some folks here might learn some lessons as well if they're dealing with cyber threat intelligence in the real world. That said, I've specifically tried to make as much of this as non-technical, so it's broadly applicable. So I'm looking at generalist cyber threat intelligence here. So I'm not going to be talking about reverse engineering and all of that. It's way smarter people who've already spoken today looking at these things. So, yeah, and the other thing that I do want to make sure I cover off is that this isn't really aimed at those folks who do CTI for like a CTI organization. So like your Mandiants and your CrowdStrikes and your Recorded Futures and that, you're a different problem set. I'm more talking about a CTI analyst jumping into an organization that doesn't do that as part of one of their major income streams. So, when I was but a junior consultant, I remember rocking up to one particular organization, not realizing I was part of a much broader consultancy package that had been sold to them. I rocked up, I found my client-side manager, and there I was, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to go for my first day. All I wanted to do was jump in to do CTI. I didn't even know really what that meant at the time, but it sounds cool, right? I rocked up to this lovely middle manager. They were very, very patient with me as I was explaining what I was there to do and all of the wonderful things I was going to achieve for them. And then they sort of stopped and looked at me and just questioned why I existed. Not as a human being, like they weren't rude. They were very much questioning why CTI as a thing had even really rocked up in their workplace. And that was my very first confrontation with maybe sometimes organizations get sold things they don't need, which has really set me up for the rest of my life in cybersecurity. And I think that's fantastic. What it did teach me pretty early on is that cyber threat intelligence, depending on the area that you and the role that you're filling, may not necessarily be what an organization needs, wants, or requires. And in fact, it can be pretty beneficial to actually focus on non-traditional cyber threat intelligence flavored things well before you get into all the fancy things. The reason I say that is that if you have rocked up to an organization that has been sold or has purchased a cyber threat intelligence capability, be that a person, a threat stream, a whatever, but they don't yet figure out how their network needs to be backed up, they don't have little things like logging enabled on like Active Directory, then perhaps cyber threat intelligence is probably not what their main goal should be for now. It is surprisingly disturbing how common this is, and it's, I would argue, part of the issue with the immaturity of the market, at least in Australia, with my experiences, is that quite often places will think that CTI sounds amazing and then realize they've got no way to implement it. And that is the key lesson that I learned out of that, is it's worth sitting down with a customer and figuring out what they need. And I say that because the other key assumption that I made as a junior was that my customers would know exactly what they wanted and how they should ask for it. My favorite part about this one was being asked by a very different client, luckily, to do a threat assessment on a country that they were interested in at the time. And little old me thought that this was amazing, it was really interesting. I got to go and learn a bunch of stuff. I Googled things very aggressively for a not insignificant portion of time. Put together this wonderful report. There was graphics. I put like a chart in. It was amazing. Ask me about it, I'll tell you. It's so good. Everything from like the typical threat actors that were from that country, third-party threat actors that were in that, like that acted in that country, geopolitical stuff, risk to electronic devices while traveling. Put together this amazing report. It's about 2 weeks of my life that I'll never get back. Submitted it to the customer, and the customer, within 5 minutes, for like a 40-page report, responded with, "We just want to know what it's like to work with someone from that country. We're meeting them somewhere completely different." The problem that I encountered was that threat assessments for that client were a particular format, and that was the format that everyone in that client used. And so when someone asked for a threat assessment, it was just assumed that that's what they wanted. At no stage during that 2 weeks did I actually sit down and think to talk to the client about, is the product that I was developing actually what they needed? That was wrong. It's something that I wish I could take back. That said, has definitely made me a lot more forward-leaning now when it comes to engaging with potential clients about what they actually request, like what they're requesting and what they actually need, because they're quite often two very different things. But it also highlights one of the dangers of doing things the way that they have always been done. And you're not going to believe this, but a lot of my stories are from when I was a fairly junior analyst. I don't know why that is. Truly a mystery. New gig, still young, still junior, still very excited, still very amazed by technology. I had been put into a team of other CTI analysts at that stage, and it was fun. I was excited to work in a team as opposed to as an individual. And my new team leader, the senior analyst in that team, worked through the schedule with me, told me about all their report formats, and that's how they do things. Again, being young and new to a brand new team and getting excited about that, I kind of went along with that. I didn't really question too much. I just went, yep, that's what needs to be done. That's how it's going to be done. That's the way they've said that it needs to be done. About 3 months into that gig, I realized that there was an entire area that no one in that team had been paying attention to, because none of the reporting templates had that particular category in it. So therefore, if it wasn't in the template, it wasn't necessary. That was what I would describe politely as a bit of a mistake. It was a particularly important category because it had direct impacts, and we saw a lot of that category in some subsequent attacks, which was lovely. But again, because the team had been so used to doing things the way they've always been done, no one questioned it. And that, the key lessons that I grabbed out of this particular incident was that it's, and I love this in junior analysts as well, it's the key difference that I see between an average analyst and a fantastic analyst, is that level of being inquisitive, always inquiring, and also never accepting an excuse of because that's the way that we've always done it when a senior analyst is expected to explain things. I think I've caught myself trying to use that line a couple of times on some juniors that I've been training, and immediately regretted it and stopped myself and had to explain it. And I love it when people actually call that out and question that mindset as well, because it leads to some pretty dangerous cognitive biases, as was mentioned earlier during the day. And it's also worth noting that while it's great being focused on pumping out things and templates that you want, it's always worth exploring things and trying to do some stuff that is not always standard. Excuse me. As I die quietly. And look at different ways that things can be done, and the ways that cyber threat intelligence doesn't necessarily need to be actionable. I know everyone loves the concept of actionable intelligence when it comes to these things. Sometimes, however, it doesn't need to be actionable, it just needs to be relevant. And being beholden to templates and processes that have never changed can really, really restrict that. My next favorite one is give no context. So excitingly, another part that I really enjoy, and I struggled with this a lot when I was dealing with far too many new and overwhelming streams of threat reporting. Understanding collection assets and the data that they're providing is, I would argue, pretty vital. We had a very solid reporting stream on a non-state threat group. It was really, really good insights into not just their techniques, tactics, and procedures, but also who they were actually going to go after. Like, not just like the industry vertical, but actual specific companies that they were chasing. And it was to the point where that was so reliable, we kind of over-relied on it. We didn't think to pick up alternate sources of information. And that worked out really well while that source was, in fact, reliable. So many things are breaking. So while that source was reliable, it was good. What we noticed after a while was that their actual level of information and the intelligence they were providing on the targets that they were actually going after had been dropping off and becoming much, much less effective, to the point where they were just no longer useful. But their TTPs, or their description of the group's tactics, techniques, and procedures was still actually pretty good. What we hadn't realized is that that entire reporting stream was from a human source that had been being run. And unfortunately, that particular individual had been removed from that threat group, so that they no longer actually saw their active target lists, but instead just kept in contact with their old friends. So they could still report on TTPs relatively accurately. But it wasn't until we started digging into that and why some information was still accurate, some wasn't, that we actually realized that we'd become overly reliant on a single source of reporting for everything to do with this group. That's super not ideal. That's why it's really important to understand the collection assets that you have access to, because each of your collection assets has strengths and weaknesses, and understanding what those strengths and weaknesses are should shape the value of the information that you can derive from those collection assets. Also, really importantly, is it highlights whether there's gaps in your collection. That's also pretty vital, because it turns out, and forgive me, I'm not going to try and do a Donald Rumsfeld on you, but you don't know what you don't know, right? If you can identify gaps, you realize that you need to fill those gaps, or you can at least acknowledge that you don't have good visibility into that particular area. And the other part that I've found with this is that people tend to place, and it's a cognitive bias, I'm sure someone would love to talk to you about that in far more detail, but people love to place far too much emphasis on information that they like or are more comfortable with or are very familiar with. So if they understand a particular data source, if they understand a particular reporting stream better than others, it's quite likely that they will invest in that more, report it more, and report it as fact more. And that can be very dangerous if you don't have a good understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of those collection assets. And I love this one because Civilized mentioned it in their talk just a little bit ago, which was fantastic, about knowing your customer's environment. Forgive me for half a second. I'm also putting water in my face like a real adult who's trying not to choke to death. Don't recommend. It's horrible, horrible stuff. So I was asked to look at a particular customer's environment so that I could get an understanding of how threats would go about compromising their system. Pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy. But it was an air-gapped system, which was interesting for me. That removed immediately like a large attack surface. I'm not particularly worried about phishing emails from a internal network, for example. Not to say completely ignore them, but it does remove a large attack surface. So, I was mostly focused on trusted insiders, maybe a little bit of Tempest stuff, but, not too strange. It's quite interesting. What I found was really interesting, though, was after a couple of weeks of looking into the network, some really helpful contractors who were not me had come along at one stage as part of fixing some particular bit of software. They got really annoyed at having to move all of these files from an internet-connected computer to a non-internet-connected computer. I think most people can see where this might end up going. So very helpfully, what they did was they put in what they described as a jump box, which was a laptop that they owned that was allowed to connect to the network, that's in the air-gapped network, and then they connected that laptop all the way to another computer that did have direct access to the internet. Now, I spoke to the contractors after this, which was delightful, and it was I politely tried to hint at them that perhaps, even with the amazing jump box, that perhaps that was not quite an air-gapped network anymore once you eventually connected it to the internet. We had some professional disagreements about that, which was also very entertaining for me a couple of years ago. But, it is what it is. The customer at that stage made the mistake of assuming that their network would never, ever be connected to the internet because it was an air-gapped network. So all of the typical logging and detections you might have for internet-flavored things had not been enabled. I enjoy this dying bit. It's lots of fun. And what this particular incident really caused me to realize was I should never, ever, under any circumstances, trust that a customer knows that their environment. Not because the customer is silly, not because they're dumb, not because they don't like documentation, but it turns out that the way that a network was originally designed, architected, and built is not necessarily the way that it's going to be 2, 3, 4 minutes, weeks, months after it's actually been put into production. So it's not necessarily the customer's fault they don't know things. The other half of that is that making assumptions about how a customer network works is also quite disappointing as an analyst on the other side. And again, I'm going to throw this back to Civilized talk about enjoying how developers like running code on things, and you can tell how exactly excited they are when it comes to their day by how much swearing there is. The favorite one that tripped me up is I found a bunch of logs, was looking at some really weird traffic going to a server that was effectively named file server. There was a bunch of really weird internet traffic that really shouldn't be there. Just a bunch of really dumb stuff that should not be anywhere near a file server. And I was getting really concerned about it. Started to go hunting for things. And then someone politely tapped me on the shoulder from that company. They're like, don't worry about that one. It's fine. And that, of course, confused me because this is weird traffic going to a file server. That's ideally not what you want, right? Turns out the last IT admin at that particular place had gotten sick of explaining email to people, so it named their Exchange server file server. And that's why there was a bunch of really weird traffic going to and from it, because it turns out not a file server. Again, don't assume that you know everything about your customer's environment. They've probably been living in it longer than you. Doesn't mean they know everything, but they probably know a little bit of history. And then my favorite one, time. I know that there's been a couple of digital forensics talks today, and I'm sure that Shanna's probably got some stories in here as well. Time is the worst. And I don't just say that as a filthy Queenslander now living in a state with daylight savings. My cows are confused, my curtains are fading early, no one knows what to do. I don't just say that as that. Time is, in fact, the worst by any stretch, not just from a developer perspective. I know how much developers hate time and time zones. We had a particular incident at a client that we were looking through. It had affected multiple sites around the world. And we had then subsequent threat intelligence reporting looking at the threat group and their activities before, during, and after the actual incident. When we put all of that together, it didn't make any sense whatsoever. Nothing flowed logically. It sounded like the threat actors were inside the network before any exploits were run. They had moved laterally before they'd compromised their first device. Data was exfiltrated before code was being executed. All of this really weird stuff that, according to ICD's magical cyber kill chain, TM registered trademark, just shouldn't happen. Like, it's just very confusing. It took me entirely far too long to realize that we'd had logs from all the different locations in local times. The threat intelligence reporting was done in a US time zone. There was other reporting that had come in at UTC or GMT times, and it was just really, really sad making. If you don't take in, and then in the middle of that, that's right, because it was a multi-day incident. It happened just at the changeover of daylight savings as well, which then destroyed us even more. It was like, it wasn't a particularly complex incident, but actually trying to make sense of it took more time than the incident itself. I can't even begin to describe how many analysts' time has tripped up. It is just, it is the worst, right? It's also really important, and this is the other one that I find a little bit to be entertaining. When people are looking at adversary activity in logs, in reports, however they want to, they're looking at times for things. And I know when, especially when it comes to sort of like some malware reverse engineering, looking at compile times and time zones, looking at adversary activity over time, and you see those wonderful timelines done up by some of the cyber threat intelligence companies. All very entertaining. It's really worth noting that at the other end of the internet of tubes, or the series of tubes that is the internet, I should say, there are human beings. And human beings do weird stuff at weird times. For example, today I am sitting somewhere near a couch watching a conference, which is not my usual Sunday activity. Other people will have Tinder dates. They will want to go shopping. They will want to have a health appointment. And guess what? Adversaries are also very much like this. So weird gaps and unexplained delays between adversary activities might be unexplained on the receiving end of them, but they probably make a lot of sense to the person who's just ducked down to the shops to go and grab like some chicken tendies. So don't assume that times need to be perfect and that everyone in an adversary country works 9 to 5 and never takes a lunch break. And that, ladies and gentlefolk, is a brief history of some of the mistakes that I have made as a junior analyst, and sometimes as a senior analyst. I won't pretend to be perfect by any stretch. I hope that some of them are at least a little bit interesting to folks. I will say that I wish someone, when I put this presentation together, it was based around, if I could go back and tell my younger self a bunch of mistakes not to make, this is the key things that I'd want to know. So genuinely, if anyone's been sitting there going, this is super easy, I knew all of this, I would have liked for you to also invent time travel and go back. And it's just fun talking about things that I've failed at as well. So noting that I've actually run a little bit early for a pleasant change,